Reserve a point of order. Mr. Frost is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm offering an amendment to this misguided resolution that would essentially work to take out the lies and the smoke and mirrors and insert the truth of the matter before us. And the fact of the matter is that Chairman Comer has a history of selective treatment of the facts presented to him that would really make any witness concerned about any kind of closed-door procedure or deposition. My amendment outlines how last month Chairman Comer tried to push this fake impeachment by selectively talking about a truck that President Biden initially made payments on while he was still a private citizen that his son, Hunter Biden, later paid him back for. The month before, Chairman Comer selectively released just a one-page of a four-page email chain to falsely claim that regulators were concerned that Hunter Biden was money laundering when that wasn't true. What the chairman selectively forgot to share is that the other 3 pages of the email directly contradicted his claims. Regulators explicitly stated that the transactions were reasonably and consistent with the business profile, and that's a quote, and that the entity was transparent. And it doesn't stop there. My amendment outlines how the chairman has misrepresented the mountain of bank records that show no wrongdoing, the fact that Chairman Comer has only released 2 of the 17 witness transcripts so far. We want him to release the transcripts. And we also know that the chairman has interviewed some of Hunter Biden's associates, and it seems that to the rest of America and no dirt could be found, and because of that, they wanted to bury the truth. But the truth is out because the truth is that this has been a complete waste of time. Republican claims all throughout this case barely hold up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. And it's not just me saying that. We've heard it on Fox News. We've heard it from the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, CNN, and others who have been investigating the chairman's false claims of evidence against President Biden. And once again, it's been said time and time again, Hunter Biden took us up on the offer of sitting in that chair in this committee and publicly answering questions so that way the public can see it and so that way he doesn't have his words misrepresented in a closed-door deposition. And what this works to do is give the entire story. If you're going to vote to hold him in contempt, at least vote yes on this amendment so we can include the full story in this piece of legislation. It is the fear of the truth that has stopped the chairman from accepting Hunter Biden's offer to testify publicly, and my amendment essentially lays it all out on the table. I urge adoption of my amendment, and then let's move on and do the real work of the American people, especially in these difficult times. I yield back.
Does any other member wish to speak?
Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
Chair recognizes Mr. Donald.
Mr. Chairman, my inquiry is this, that considering, though it seems to be we're going to be going into these amendments where the context of the matter at hand has been debated since 10 a.m. this morning, I would move, Mr. Chairman, that further debate on amendments will be considered under 20 minutes of structured debate in total, 10 minutes for each side of majority and minority on the committee to fully debate the merits of each amendment going forward, Mr. Chairman. That's my question for the parliamentary.
Mr. Erskine.
Yeah, but I would move to accept that and move by unanimous consent that we accept that proposal.
So without objection, so ordered. 10-minute debate on each side. Does any member wish to debate?
Mr. Chairman.
Further?
Mr. Frost.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out to what my colleague just said. As it relates to members of the United States military whose promotions were being held up because of a senator who had problems from an ideological point of view with bodily autonomy, the message to them was, ours is not to reason why, but to do or die. But then to a gentleman here who did complain and fight, wrote a book about his issues, the message was completely different, which I think shows the hypocrisy in this room right now from the other side of the aisle. I'm from the state of Florida. This war on wokeism is not new to me. And it's a shame that Republicans on this committee haven't caught on to my governor DeSantis' failing presidential campaign that's based on this war on woke. And this misplacement on wokeism in the military endangers America's national security by ignoring the real threats. Some of the real threats to our national security are low military recruitment and retention rates, which is what I want to focus on today. Look, service members aren't leaving the military because of DEI training, or because a military base was renamed, or because someone accessed an abortion. But what I do hear from my constituents is this. I've had folks write about problems with housing allowance being too low in the military. People messaging me about saying medications are too expensive. Folks worrying that service members won't be able to get pay if Republicans in Congress shut down the government. These are the real things that resonate with the American people, because these are the issues that this committee needs to be addressing. General, you testified that the Army became more diverse and welcoming to soldiers of color over your time in service. How has that inclusion helped retain talented service members?
We have a greater, thank you, Congressman, we have a greater pool to draw from. We didn't used to be able to draw from people of color or women, or if we had LGBTQ, they were kicked out, of which I know many that were kicked out. We have a broader thing. We need every person to be able to serve. And we can't do that if we are trying to kick people out or not allowing people to serve and not make it welcoming. We're a better Army because of our diversity.
I 100% agree with you. I mean, we know at West Point that black students had highlighted during their time the art memorializing the traitor Confederate General Robert E. Lee that hung on the wall, and the fact that the only black person hanging on the walls was someone who was a slave. And I think that things like that hurt our military readiness and national security when it makes our service members uncomfortable. Diversity, equity, inclusion strengthens our national military. It does not work against it. General, you've also testified about your own story of service. Quote, I didn't choose the Army because of patriotism. I signed up for the money, end quote. And I don't bring that up as a disparaging thing, because we know that this is something that is true for many of our service members. And especially when I speak with folks who look like myself in my community that are looking at joining the military. You joined to help afford your college, and ended up staying for more than 4 decades. So thank you so much for your service. We know that many soldiers enlist for financial reasons, but then choose not to re-enlist because it's unaffordable for them. Have you observed any trends around how economic struggles can stunt a soldier's career?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I particularly think that's true because our soldiers now deploy, or actually rotate so often, to Eastern Europe, to South Korea, and to the Middle East without additional money for that. And so if you're doing 2 9-month rotations to one of those 2 places, plus National Training Center or other things, it's incredible, difficult, particularly for the family at home, because they have no great child care options.
Yeah, and I would love to host a hearing about that instead, to see how we can handle those struggles. Since at least the 1940s, Congress has given the United States military money to create signing and re-enlistment bonuses to incentivize service members to join and stay in the service. General, do you think the military should be collecting data on why and when bonuses are helpful so we can better understand the financial hardships of our service members?
Yes, we have been doing bonuses at least since I've been in, and they work, because just like I was a poor kid coming from rural Georgia, I had no way of getting through college without it. Those financial incentives matter in an all-volunteer force.
A second thing that this committee should be hosting hearings on to figure out how we can better our national security and military readiness and preparedness. Look, and I know we have Mr. Lohmeyer and folks who have had uncomfortable or maybe negative interpretations or experiences with DEI, and I would never take away someone's experience from them. But what I do want to call out is there's a difference between seeing something that you see value in, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity in our military, and saying, we ought to fix these problems. I think there's some problems with it. I think we ought to fix them, versus saying we should just completely get rid of it. I mean, in 1954, when we began to desegregate schools in this country, we knew it would be uncomfortable. We knew there would be problems, but we did it because it was the right thing to do. This hearing is entitled "The Risk of Progressive Ideologies in the U.S. Military." DEI is not a progressive ideology. It's just the right thing to do. If we want to talk about progressive ideology in the militaries, we can talk about affordable housing and food. We can talk about tuition assistance. We can talk about universal health care that the military provides, progressive ideologies in the military, but not DEI. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Floor to Mr. Frost for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, since Republican politicians have no plan to address the real issues of this country, low wages, high prices, etc., their leaders at the highest levels have dipped into the fascist playbook to blame communities and to blame minorities and to blame immigrants for the issues that Americans are facing. And these days, the more fear you can stoke, the better. I mean, one of my colleagues, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has called immigrants terrorists. And many on the right take their cues from their top leader, former President Donald Trump. From 2015 to just this past Monday night in Iowa, he has used fear and racism to spread false narratives. He said that immigrants are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, end quote, echoing the same language used by Hitler to describe Jewish people. Mr. Beer, why is it grossly incorrect to paint immigrants as criminals, and why is this rhetoric not only false, but dangerous?
Look, U.S. Census Bureau data is quite clear. Immigrants are about half as likely to be incarcerated in the United States as others. If you look at the illegal immigrant population as we have at the Cato Institute, it's, again, it's about 30% less. And that includes all the people that we're putting in cages just because they're immigrants. So it's not true that they're more likely to end up in our criminal justice system, burdening our courts and our police. And also, if you look at area studies that look at what happens to crime rates when an infusion of immigrants comes in, we've seen during the 1990s, especially when you had this huge wave, far exceeding anything that's happened recently, of immigrants come into major cities. There was this rebirth in the economy in those areas. They started businesses, they rejuvenated the communities, filled vacant housing, and that brought crime rates down as well. So there are multiple mechanisms by which immigrants reduce crime and make for a more secure community.
Of course, thank you. Mr. Beer, are you familiar with stochastic terrorism? Stochastic terrorism is to provoke random acts of ideological motivated violence that are statistically predictable. Last year, a gunman murdered 23 people and injured another 22 in El Paso, Texas, using the same rhetoric of invasion and the great replacement theory that we hear from Donald Trump and many leaders on the right. Mr. Beer, what's the point of stoking this type of hate towards immigrants?
Look, there's only two reasons why you use the word invasion. The first is you want to justify violence against them. Otherwise, you'd say it's a violation of the law, it's illegal, you want a law enforcement response. Invasion calls for a military violent response to these people. The second reason is to invoke invasion under the constitutional clauses in which that is used. There's two. One, states can respond to an invasion unilaterally. We know what an invasion under the Constitution means. James Madison said an invasion is an act of war. So we know what a real invasion is. We know the difference between people coming to serve us and work for us versus an act of war.
So this language fuels a lot of these hateful, violent acts we've seen.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just hosted a roundtable in my district because my constituents are terrified about the talk that's going on up here. An amazing community leader and pastor, Father Jose, brought up a really good point that migrants don't just want to come here. We told them to come here. And Mr. Beer, the Statue of Liberty, situated next to Ellis Island, an iconic American symbol, reads, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let's be honest with immigrants who deserve better than what you're offering them. Don't welcome immigrants if you plan to reject them. If you keep pushing your bigoted H.R. 2 bill, then also pass this bill. I've taken the liberty of drafting it for you. It removes the Statue of Liberty, our largest symbol that tells people to come here. This is who you are, removing the fabric of America. So I want to know which Republican who supports and voted for H.R. 2 will introduce this bill. If you're going to support H.R. 2 and these bigoted measures, the least you can do is not be a damn liar. As Americans, we must reject hypocrisy and lead with love. And as long as Republican officials are more interested in peddling hate, the solutions and to fixing this problem in our immigration system will only get worse. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you all so much. We're just going to close out with Max Frost. We have to go back to our deposition. So Max, if you could close this out.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. Look, if you ever wonder why 50% of this country doesn't vote, you don't have to look further than the hour we just spent in there on this deposition. If you wonder why a lot of this country doesn't hold Congress in a high regard, don't look further than the hour we just had in this deposition. A fishing expedition, like Vice Speaker Member Ocasio-Cortez just brought up, looking into things that, number one, have nothing to do with the president, spending 10 minutes talking about the technology of a speakerphone, spending multiple minutes talking about a rope line interaction. There is no evidence. This entire thing is built off of a lie. And I'll tell you, we knock a lot of doors back at home. People don't care about this. They want us to work on affordable housing. They want us to work on health care, ending gun violence, ending the climate crisis, ensuring that we save lives around the world. These are the things that people care about, not this. So let's get back to work, and I hope that this will be the end of this horrible experiment.
Mr. Frost, what are they saying about the speakerphone? With that, I'm going to turn this over to Congressman Maxwell Frost.
Thank you, Robert. Hello, everybody. I am here today to stand alongside of some of my colleagues and these creators to say, not only am I a no on tomorrow's TikTok ban bill, but I'm a hell no on tomorrow's TikTok ban bill. Look, we got to be clear. There's going to be an attempt to try to spin this to say it's not a ban, it's not a ban. But let's look at the facts. If you research and look into acquisitions of this size, putting a 180-day time period on it, 5 months, especially, we're talking about a very large company. There's only a few players who can even afford to buy something like TikTok, which puts us into antitrust territory. There are automatic pauses that are put from a month to a year that can inhibit on this 5-month period that we put up. So essentially what this bill is doing is setting this wholesale up to fail. And I truly believe that there's too much ambiguity here to mess with, especially when we're talking about an application that is a huge part of our lives and of for small businesses and content creators here in the United States. That's reason number one. It's unreasonable to believe that in 180 days that a buyer will be found. And that the deal can move forward, which would result in TikTok being banned. Whether it's banned for a year or 2 years or 6 months, a ban is a ban. Number two, I believe that it is an infringement on our First Amendment rights, and it violates the Constitution. You don't have to just ask me. The American Civil Liberties Union also agrees with us on this as well. And the way they put it, I think, is great. There's going to be a lot of folks who say, oh, well, because it's a for sale and they're not explicitly banning it, it's going to be fine in the courts. ACLU calls that a fig leaf of an argument, and I also agree. We're talking about a platform that allows people to put out information, news, whatever they want to put out that over 170 million Americans use. And I think that's important to keep in mind. The last thing I'll say that's top of mind for me is a lot of y'all know I'm from the state of Florida, the beautiful state of Florida, and sometimes scary state of Florida. I live in a state where our governor, Ron DeSantis, and his cronies and neo-fascist right wing is moving to change history in the state of Florida. Middle schoolers will read in their textbooks that black people that were enslaved receive personal benefit from it. Don't Say Gay was passed to erase our queer communities from our campuses. They're passing legislation to try to shield what's going on with the climate crisis. I hear from students all the time that get their information, the truth of what has happened in this country, from content creators on TikTok and on different social media platforms. And to take that away, I'm just thinking specifically about my constituents right now, about people in the state of Florida, people in the state of Texas, where we are on the front lines of these fascist attacks. It's platforms like this that can help combat some of that disinformation. Now, I do have to say, am I concerned about Americans' data? Yes, I am. I am highly concerned about our data being collective and being misused by both foreign adversaries and also domestic companies. But this bill does not fix that problem. Let's be honest here. This bill doesn't fix it. We could pass this. It could get signed tomorrow. I hope it doesn't. And in 6 months, in a year, we'll be back at the same conversation, possibly talking about some other social media platform that's misusing our data. So if Congress wants to be serious and craft legislation that'll protect all Americans from all bad actors, I'm in. But for this, count me out, 110%. And with
I yield to my colleague and friend, Congressman Maxwell Frost. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and thank you so much to my colleagues who flew from out of town to be here in the beautiful state of Florida, especially Leader Jeffries. Thank you for being here. You know, oftentimes we see leaders co-opt certain language and for political purposes. Language or movements or culture. We see it all the time. I mean, one I like to point to is how the right wing has acts like they own Christianity and acts like they own the Bible. You know, I was raised Southern Baptist, and so I can't say enough of how frustrating it's been to see folks weaponize my religion and my faith to push a restrictive right-wing agenda. And not only do we see it with Christianity and religion in general, but we also see it with fundamental American beliefs and values. I want to do something real quick. I'm going to read 3 quotes. I'm not going to say who they're from. And I'd like y'all to tell me whether you think it's a friend or foe of freedom and liberty or of the abortion access movement. So here's one. Quote, "We have to understand that the threats to freedom are not simply a result of what happens in legislatures. You got to fight to win." What do you think, friend or foe? Friend? Okay. It's Governor Ron DeSantis. Let me do another one. Quote, "In America, we believe in the majesty of freedom and the dignity of the individual." Friend or foe? Foe? Oh, you're catching on. That's former President Donald J. Trump. The dignity of the individual. Here's my last one. Quote, "We can either have a free society or we can have a biomedical security state. People are going to be free to choose and make their own decisions for themselves and their families." Friend or foe? Foe? Another Ron DeSantis quote. See, right-wing leaders in this state love to preach freedom, liberty, patriotism, and then they never back it up with action. So there's a lot of talk about freedom there from 2 prominent Floridians, right-wing Floridians. Ms. Dorber, in the moments where you were with your doctor here in the state of Florida, and you were receiving the information that you got, did you feel that freedom?
No.
Did you feel that liberty?
No.
If we go back 5, 6 years ago, did you ever think something like this would be possible in this country or in this state? What happened to you?
No.
Why?
Because I felt free.
You know, not only do they co-opt freedom and patriotism and liberty, but they also co-opt other things as well. Ms. Timaraju, you are an organizer. You've been doing this work for a long time. Do you hate adoption?
Do I get adoption?
Do you hate adoption?
My children are adopted.
Oh, your children are adopted.
Yeah, actually.
Well, because
I
those on
suffered
the
from
right wing would make us.
endometriosis.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I suffered from endometriosis and I adopted my children.
Well, folks would have us believe that people like you and I hate adoption. I'm adopted.
That's right.
Myself. And I despise the fact that my identity and my story, and same thing with yours, is used by the right wing to try to restrict people's rights. Why do you think the right wing uses adoption a lot of times to help push this anti-freedom agenda?
Well, it fits into their, theological power and control, goals. But I'll say one thing, and I think you'll appreciate this about adoption. Before I adopted my children, I spoke to many adult adoptees. I wanted to understand their perspective on reproductive freedom and on abortion access because I knew what I did. Across the board, every single adult adoptee I said, I wish my birth parents had the freedom to decide. Across the board. Adoptees have been co-opted by this movement. The adoption narrative has been co-opted. Adoption is traumatic. It is not the silver bullet solution despite what Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett asserted in the Dobbs discourse, it is not a solution to a lack of abortion access.
Thank you so much. You know, yes. I never knew my biological parents my whole life. I connected with my biological mother a few months before deciding to run for office, so just about 2.5 years ago. And when I was talking to her about the story and why she made the decision she made and what was sacred about it, what I got from that conversation is what was sacred about it wasn't just about the decision that she made, but about the fact that she got to make it. And so freedom, liberty, and patriotism isn't just about bald eagle, beer, and flag. It's about the people who live in the country. And so we'll continue to fight for bodily autonomy for all people here in the state of Florida and across the country. Thank you so much to our witnesses.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioner. Like many of my constituents, I'm deeply concerned with the H5N1 avian flu outbreak. It's impacted birds, livestock. At least one person in Orlando lost several of our Lake Eola swans, which is in the center of my district. It's a symbol of our city. While it does seem clear that the avian flu is not currently able to spread easily among people, folks are still wondering about how safe they are. It's brought up a lot in my district. Commissioner, how is the FDA, in coordination with the Department of Agriculture and the CDC, ensuring that Americans have access to reliable and up-to-date information about this?
Well, thanks for bringing this up. It is a very important issue today. As you have noted, avian flu has been around for a while, but it's only recently that it's now infected cattle, and now cows in multiple states. And so this is really an all-of-government effort. There are Zoom conferences multiple times a day now involving FDA, CDC, agriculture, as you said, but also many other areas of government that have a stake in the game of interstate commerce and Department of Justice and issues that are related. So we're all working together, and you should see frequent communications as we work through this, remembering that this is the most recent episodes with the cows is a relatively new thing. So we're starting with a lot of uncertainty and working our way through it.
And since 2006, the federal government has stockpiled antivirals designed to prevent severe illness and death from the flu. Will this medication be effective against avian?
Well, this relates to a discussion that we just had. It's very useful to know the molecular or genetic composition of the virus. And in this case, if you look at the composition of this virus, there's nothing in it that should confer resistance to the current antivirals that we have stockpiled. So we feel good about that. I should note it's always the case that when you have an actual illness, you have to empirically prove that it works. And so fortunately right now, there's really only one infected human that we know of. So it's not something that we can test, but it looks good at this point.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Commissioner. Another subject that's really important to me and is personal to me are allergies. I'm a survivor of anaphylactic shock just a few years ago that almost killed me. I also want to make sure that the other 20 million Americans with food allergies know that what they're taking or what they're eating is safe. A recent study found that 93% of all medicines contain an allergen, and many popular over-the-counter allergy drugs contain lactose. Do you believe that the FDA has the power to require labeling of prescription and over-the-counter medicines for food allergens and gluten?
We definitely have the power to require labeling when it's indicated.
3 years ago, President Biden signed into law the FASTER Act, requiring labeling of sesame as a food allergy, and also requiring HHS to submit a comprehensive government report on food allergies within 18 months. That report has not yet been submitted, and it's very frustrating to Americans with food allergies and their families. Does this report fall under the responsibility of the FDA, and if so, would you be able to provide an update on the status of it?
I'll have to get back with you on that because I'm not familiar with that particular report, but we are very familiar with the fact that allergies in the U.S. are apparently growing and that there is a great need to make sure we get this right.
Okay, yeah, we'd love to follow up on that. I think we even gave a heads up about that question, so you could be prepared, but it's all right. We'll follow up about it. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the beginning of his campaign for president, Donald Trump in 2015 has been consistently propagating hateful, extremist rhetoric about immigrants, including falsehoods depicting all Mexican immigrants as criminals, as drug dealers, and as rapists. At campaign events just last month, Trump claimed that immigrants are poisoning the blood of this country. The Republican witnesses here today are the latest in a line of people spreading racist, far-right fiction in an attempt to dehumanize immigrants. Mr. Beer, I want to get back to some truth in this conversation. Is someone more likely to commit a crime if they are born in the United States or if they are foreign-born?
If they are born in the United States.
And you wrote in a Time article that I have right here, quote, no matter how researchers slice the data, through the numbers show that immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born Americans. But that's not good enough for Trump followers. They firmly believe that immigrants make America less safe. What the anti-immigration crowd needs to understand is that not only are immigrants less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans, but they also protect us from crime in several ways, end quote. And you're 100% right in that. Several studies show that immigrants are 46% less likely to commit a crime, and that in communities that have had an influx of undocumented immigrants, crime actually goes down. Collectively, American undocumented immigrants pay an estimated $11.64 billion in state and local taxes every single year. And the average undocumented immigrant has been living and contributing to the economic success of our country for between 10 and 14 years. These are folks who are literally putting more into our system than they're taking out because they're undocumented. These are our friends, our family, teachers, substitute teachers, people who work in the medical field, people who work in hospitality, our neighbors, my family. Mr. Beer, how might white supremacist falsehoods about an invasion put immigrant communities in danger?
Look, we've talked about this before. We've seen the El Paso shooter manifesto, the Buffalo shooter. You go to Charlottesville, you saw what happened there. The Pittsburgh synagogue shooter. I mean, the number of crimes where now dozens of people have been murdered, it's astounding. They are saying what's motivating them. It's this idea that these people are invaders and therefore they can be responded to with military-style force.
Yeah, and it just makes me wonder because we keep hearing from colleagues on the other side, some of these witnesses, that I guess the rate doesn't matter or the data doesn't matter. And what really matters are the families and the victims, which I 100% agree with, but then they completely disregard the families and victims of immigrant communities because of the hateful rhetoric that they are pushing. What about the friends and families of victims who have been murdered in schools across this country because my colleagues refuse to do anything to end gun violence? Does that matter? I guess not. We've already seen how this hateful anti-immigrant rhetoric has been taken up by bad actors to justify horrific violence against everyday Americans. And for example, when a gunman walked into a Walmart store, killing 23 people and injuring another 22. Almost exactly a year ago, Oversight Committee Democrats called on Chairman Comer and every Oversight Republican to condemn this rhetoric. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter dated March 6, 2023 from Ranking Member Raskin to Chairman Comer, yet again inviting you to condemn white nationalism and white supremacy in all forms, including the Great Replacement theory.
Without objection.
Not only have my Republican colleagues refused to condemn this extreme rhetoric, but they've also invited witnesses here who keep pushing it. I mean, we have Mr. Chapman, a sheriff, who should really be focused on the real causes of crime and violence. Under his watch, gun-related injuries surged by 57% in 2021. Mr. Chapman, I have one simple question for you. Do you know who your county sheriff's office pays to do the firearm disposal and how much you pay them for your firearms disposal?
I would argue the statistics that you just mentioned about our...
That's not the question I asked, Sheriff. I just want to know...
I think it's important to correct the record.
I'd like to know who your office pays for firearm disposal and how much you pay them?
Our firearms are handled by our firearms unit, and any disposal will come under them.
Okay, gotcha. Many law enforcement agencies contract with disposal companies, and something that is of grave concern to me is that a lot of these companies are not doing what they've promised, and they're not destroying firearms, and we're seeing these firearms being put back on the streets, which is why I introduced my bill, Destroy Zombie Guns Act, which will make serious reforms to help keep all Americans safer. I implore my colleagues on this committee to co-sponsor the bill and to join me in fighting for real positive change for public safety for all people. Thank you. I yield back.
Now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into it, it's interesting to hear my colleague just now talk about disavowing white supremacists when in 2022, she spoke at an event led by white supremacist and white nationalist Nick Fuentes, and when asked about it, doubled down on it and said, we're going to focus on people, not labels. So get out of here with that damn hypocrisy. And Dr. Snyder, I'm going to give you some time to respond. Go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to thank the representative from Georgia by making clear with her comments and with her person that any discussion of political warfare has to include Russia, Ukraine, and America. She's just demonstrated that point, I think, very powerfully. On the question of Nazis, I've written 2 books as a historian about Nazis and the Holocaust. On the question of Ukrainian nationalism, I am the leading scholar of that subject in North America and have been writing about it for 20 years. If the chamber is interested in the degree of far-right participation in Ukrainian politics, you can be assured that no far-right party has ever crossed 3% in Ukrainian election. So of course there are bad people in every country, but by any comparative standard is a very small phenomenon. In Russia, on the other hand, the army includes openly Nazi formations, such as Rushich. The government itself is fascist in character, and it is carrying out a war which includes deportation of children by the tens of thousands, the open intention of destroying a state, as well as mass torture. So if we're looking for fascism, and if there is anyone who is sincerely concerned about halting fascism or racism, you would wish to halt Russia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Snyder. And, you know, this hearing was put together to talk about political warfare, and it's strange because a lot of my Republican colleagues seem to be pointing a lot of fingers, but not at Vladimir Putin and not holding him accountable. I mean, even top-ranking Republicans are having enough of it. Michael McCall said, quote, I think Russian propaganda has made its way into the United States. Unfortunately, it's infected a good chunk of my party's base, unquote. We just heard some of that right now. Republican Michael Turner, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, quote, we see directly coming from Russia attempts to mass communications that there are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia messages, some of which we even hear being uttered on the House floor. Dr. Snyder, can you just, talk really quickly about some of the main narratives Russia uses when engaging in political warfare?
I appreciate this question because if we're going to talk about political warfare, we have to take into account the ways that countries cooperate. It's entirely artificial to say, here's China, here's America. That means that we leave aside Xinjiang, we leave aside Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, Europe, all the places where China practices political warfare, and we leave aside Russia and Ukraine, which is where it matters the most. Political warfare is only political warfare if it passes through us. That is the intention. We've just seen an example of it passing through a person. It's only political warfare if it passes through us. What the Russians and the Chinese imitating the Russians try to do is to convince us that our system is no better than theirs, there's no point in voting, and we should support, if we support anyone at all, the person who's most likely to bring our system down. That's the point.
I really appreciate you bringing up the fact that it has to pass through us, because we just heard it here from my colleague, and here's another tweet from the same colleague saying, anyone who votes to fund Ukraine is funding the most corrupt money scheme of any foreign war in our country's history. And if you look at where this is from the Strategic Culture Foundation, an online journal run by a Russian intelligence service that has been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department for election interference. So we see it passing through us, and not just with the colleague that just spoke, but with many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And what Russian propaganda won't tell you is most of the money allocated for Ukraine is actually spent in America. 90% of it going to Americans. And so are these American companies that support Ukraine, are these allegations based on evidence, Dr. Snyder? And if not, where do these allegations against President Zelensky and his cabinet come from?
First of all, U.S. weapons are being used extremely efficiently on the Ukrainian battlefield. They're being audited in practice. Secondly, there is an American institution which does audit the way that is expended. Third of all, you're quite right. What the allocation of usually weapons that are about to be decommissioned anyway to Ukraine means is that we spend more on modern weapons inside the United States, which is why the defense industry is generally in favor of it. This trope of Ukraine being corrupt with respect to the weapons comes from a handful of Russian sources. There is no reason to think it. They're fighting for their lives. They're doing very well.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've got to let that sink in. We have members of the United States Congress using Russian disinformation to discredit Ukraine and help Russia. And I yield back. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, another example of the deep space communications that we just reestablished with Voyager 1, which is outside of our solar system, approaching interstellar space, and it came back to life. And lo and behold, we got it. And where it's located, so far away at the speed of light, the transmission takes 22 hours. And we just reestablished that.
What, if you don't mind my asking, Mr. Administrator, what caused that to come back into force?
Again, these wizards, they do all kinds of things.
Okay.
And this is a spacecraft. It's a very old spacecraft.
Right.
Voyager 1, I think it was launched back in the 70s. And so it is still perking.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. That's great information to know. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, Administrator Nelson. With the goals of returning Americans to the moon and aiming for Mars, the Artemis program has private partners in all 50 states and over 24 in Florida's 10th Congressional District, which is my district. Artemis is a significant contributor to NASA's $4.7 billion economic impact on Central Florida alone, and has partnered with the University of Central Florida Go Knights on several research projects to support lunar landing and living. This is why my colleague, Congressman Posey, and I are leading a bipartisan letter to the CJS Appropriations Subcommittee calling for additional Artemis funding to overcome delays and technical complications. Mr. Administrator, with all the challenges of such a complex and cutting-edge program, what can NASA do to minimize further delays in the Artemis mission cadence?
Well, first of all, we can have congressmen like you that help us make an additional request. Understand that we're not going to launch until it's ready. And that is because safety is our first. When we put humans on an explosive bomb called a rocket, we're going to do everything possible to make sure it's as safe as possible, realizing that everything is cutting the edge of the envelope that we do. But especially when humans are in the loop, we're going to make it that much more safe. So we're on schedule next year to have 4 astronauts circle the moon and check out the Artemis spacecraft. We are under contract with SpaceX for September of 26 to have a lander of which we would go into lunar orbit and they would transfer in and go down to the surface for 6 days. Obviously, if that lander's not ready, we're not going to fly at that time. But that is the schedule, and that's what the contract calls for.
Thank you. And the most recent success in the partnership of NASA and private space industry was a soft landing on the moon's south pole as part of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program. How does the work of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program complement the work of the Artemis program?
They are scouts for us, just like sending scouts out into the wilderness. So, for example, one of them that is going on intuitive machines at the end of the year is going to start digging in the South Pole to see if there is water underneath the surface. If there's water and it's in enough abundance, then we have rocket fuel.
And overall, what can we as members of Congress do to support the nationwide economic and scientific impact of NASA's work, especially when it comes to the Artemis program? And we know that I think any day now, China will be sending, will do the first mission to bring back things from the far side of the moon. We know this is funding these programs is the best in the best interest of our national security and the work that we do. But what can we as members of Congress do?
There's the old saying, the president proposes and the Congress disposes. You're in it. You're our partner. You make it possible for authorizing us to do this stuff and then appropriating the means by which to do it.
And lastly, can you briefly describe some of the scientific highlights of the commercial missions in terms of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program?
Oh, yes, sir. For example, this last one, it was an intuitive machine. It caught its leg on a rock as it was coming down, and it tipped over. The fact that it tipped over, it didn't have its antenna pointing in the right direction to receive. But it was still faint enough that we could get enough to know that it was alive. There were 6 NASA experiments on board. Now, this is an incredible story of the chairman of the full committee, Hal Rogers, in his district is a university, Morgan State. They have big dishes that can support the commercial program. But in this case, the clips wasn't able to communicate. They didn't have enough power from their commercial communications. But Morgan State was uniquely positioned that it could also communicate with our government deep space communications that had the power in order to receive that weak signal. And therefore, most of the objectives of the mission were successful with a connection there made through Morgan State. That is an example of a daring do that suddenly the NASA scientists and the commercial community and a university were able to figure out real time.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Administrator, and yield back.
Okay. Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Madam Secretary. It's great to be here with you. The Department of Energy has sent a lot of money to the state of Florida, strengthen and modernize our power grid, build resilience as the climate crisis worsens, creating better jobs, reducing energy burden and costs for disadvantaged communities. And this money was made possible thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. Florida wasn't the only recipient. Obviously, you were also able to get the DOE to award funds directly to community organizations and solar companies in Puerto Rico in a model that I've heard a lot about on a trip I actually recently took to Puerto Rico, ensuring that the award wasn't bottlenecked with an administering agency. My constituents want to see this model used more broadly across the federal government, especially for folks in Puerto Rico, for HUD awards, Department of Justice awards, et cetera. So I'm just curious, how exactly does this model work, specifically as it relates to Puerto Rico? And can you talk about anything that you had to overcome, any administrative hurdles you had to overcome to make that happen?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I mean, Puerto Rico, as you know, is very unique in the fact that there are layers of bureaucracy there to get anything done. Congress gave us $1 billion to be able to do rooftop solar. Thank you so much for supporting that. What we have done is we went throughout all of the island to hear how we should be distributing this, how should we be prioritizing the putting of solar panels on homes. And citizens there said to a person, Please prioritize people with disabilities, people who are poor and in last mile communities, and people who've got a health issue. So we have done that, and we've done this by tapping local community members who are in the best position to identify who those people are. Verified, of course, through their, are they qualified for SNAP, et cetera. They have to be a verification. But they are our eyes and ears and arms, really, on the ground to identify who should be able to get rooftop solar. And so we're excited to begin that process. We hope that this summer we call the Summer of Solar for Puerto Rico, and to be able to make people energy independent in light of how fragile the grid is there.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, what Americans want when it comes to federal funding is more community engagement, empowerment by directly granting awards to local governments, community groups, advocacy, or nonprofits, organizations, and small businesses. Now, a lot of my colleagues on this committee have been talking about their concern for American-made energy, and I want to talk about that. Fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, petroleum products are driving the climate crisis, as we know. Clean energy comes from renewable, zero-emission sources like solar, wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, and biomass sources. And the clean energy transition is urgent for humanity, but also for the state of Florida, as we are a frontline community in the climate crisis. Advances in technology and grid management, like those facilitated by the bipartisan infrastructure law, shore up reliability of renewable energy. Madam Secretary, how can we combat the climate crisis without transitioning to clean energy?
Well, you can't.
Okay. And if we fell behind other countries in following these advancements in solar, wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, and biomass energy, how might that impact our ability to sustain and meet our growing energy needs?
Well, let me just say that this is, our allies, our economic competitors out there, they're all vying for a piece of this from an economic point of view. They see the fact that this is a $23 trillion global market, this clean energy. All of these countries are going to need the products to be able to get them to their goals. So we have friendly competition with our allies and our adversaries about who's going to get those jobs. And so on the jobs front, this is very important, and it's why the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law have been so impactful, that we've got 600 factories so far that have announced that they're expanding as a result of those incentives in the United States, making us competitive globally. So from a global competition economically, it's vital. Obviously, we've got to do our part from a climate change perspective as well. All of the countries do. So we're working on both fronts, and actually one complements the other, and it's a win-win.
Exactly. And I think it's a really exciting time in this work, too. I mean, we have the opportunity to build a new green economy, centers workers, fights the climate crisis, and where everybody can do well. And we can't shackle America, shackle our country, because not only are we going to suffer as a humanity, but we lose out on the economic benefit. And last question, Madam Secretary, can we invest in clean energy while also looking out for the workers who currently work in fossil fuel production?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is really a primary focus, and I know, Mr. Chairman, you raised this as well. It's a primary focus of this administration. Leave no worker behind. Give them an opportunity to have a future-facing job, for their children to have a future-facing job that pays well. That is the MO of this administration.
Of course. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Chair, now recognize Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The V-22 Osprey, like all military aircraft, is only as good as it is safe. If maintenance issues or even worse, significant mechanical failures endanger the life of our service members, then the United States military cannot rely on the Osprey's unique capabilities, no matter how unique those capabilities may be. In the last 2 years, the V-22s have been involved in 4 major fatal accidents, which have resulted in the deaths of 20 service members just in the last year. These are catastrophes where American service members lost their lives. And it's not just a problem with the Osprey. In military aircraft across the board, safety and readiness metrics are dropping. So far this year, Army aircraft have experienced twice the rate of major incidents than any year in the last decade. Air Force major incidents hit a 5-year high in the fiscal year 2023. Despite us continuing to raise our defense budget, almost nearing $1 trillion in the one we're currently debating. Mr. Belk, can you explain the reasons underlying this troubling trend?
Congressman, thank you for your question. With respect to some of the specific data you've shared, what I'd like to do is come back with some additional context and response for that we can get after some of the more specifics. Generally speaking, what I would say is that as the force continues to transform and shift in the types of training and operations that it's doing to mitigate and address new and emerging threat contexts, this is placing additional stress on the force. Whether or not this translates into additional mishaps or not, we're still looking at very closely, but we're monitoring that very closely to ensure that as we continue to transform as a force, we understand how we do so as we operate and train in the safest manner possible.
Recent data suggests that the military is relying on aircraft that are not meeting readiness goals. In 2022, the GAO released a report that studied readiness among 49 different aircrafts over the span of a decade. GAO found that only one of those aircrafts, met their mission readiness goals every year, and only 4 met their readiness goals a majority of the years studied. And 26 of those aircraft did not meet readiness goals in a single year between 2011 and 2001. This trend is both alarming and unacceptable. I understand that the V-22 has now been approved to return to limited operation, despite there being no clear conclusion of the investigation of the most recent crash. So, Mr. Belk, what did the DoD learn about the accident in its return to flight assessment, and how exactly does that differ from the initial crash investigation?
So, Congressman, if I understand the question correctly, we learned, and I would say when I say we in OSD, we in the with the military departments, learned rather contemporaneously about the incident that we're talking about in November. In terms of the approach, we take and I'll defer to Admiral Chevy to speak to some of the specifics on how we conduct upon notification of a mishap at a military department or service level. What I would say is that from my perspective, we approach this particular incident with the same level of rigor and care and consideration in terms of how to get after the fundamental understanding of the events that transpired and led to the incident, and then the mitigation steps that need to be taken as we learned information to ensure the continued safest environment, operating environment, and training environment for our service members, and then what, if any, steps to include the stand down that Admiral Chevy alluded to continue the safest environment possible.
Yeah, I mean, Lieutenant Colonel Eric Cranford, the squadron commander where the most recent crash occurred, stated, quote, "We're looking at 750,000 flight hours of history making data-driven decisions," end quote. And so what we're looking for is more transparency in terms of this data. We want to know what y'all are finding out from it, because transparency equals heightened scrutiny, and we need the heightened scrutiny right now as we've lost 20 service members in 1 year. So, Mr. Belk, your job is to ensure the readiness of the total force. So where does the fault lie for the mission readiness failures that GAO identified, and will you take responsibility for addressing them?
So, Congressman, I can assure you that the department at every echelon and every level takes very seriously matters of accountability upon understanding the facts and circumstances around a particular event, and then what, if any, steps need to be taken to either hold organizations or individuals accountable for errors or actions that need to be held accountable for. So upon understanding those circumstances and learning those events, you have my commitment that we will continue to do those things that need to ensure that accountability is meted out and addressed upon learning about the specifics in those instances. I think also, as Admiral Chevy alluded to, some of these investigations remain open, but what I can assure you is those close out, we will be in a position to maximize the amount of transparency about the information that we learn from those investigations to this committee and elsewhere within the Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, because the GAO report that found that 26 different military aircraft did not meet the readiness goals in any of the years that they were studied is a cause of great concern. We don't want to be in this same place a few years from now with a different aircraft with 20 new service members who lost their lives during a training mission. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this committee, and I acknowledge.
Without objection, the gentleman is now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, my heart is heavy. I'm brought back to this moment in history where in June 12th, 2016, 49 angels were murdered in cold blood on the dance floor and on the floor of Pulse Nightclub in my city, in my district, and in my home of Orlando, Florida. I'm angry. I'm angry that we live in a world and that we live in a country where gun violence can drastically change or end your life. I'm angry that I serve in a chamber where seemingly most of the folks here don't want to do a single damn thing about it. And I'm angry that I've been fighting for this since I was 15, and we're still in this fight. And so I just want to express my condolences and send immense amounts of love to the families and to the survivors of the Pulse Night massacre, and tell y'all that we will continue to honor the lives of those 49 angels with nothing but action, with nothing but sweat equity, until we end gun violence in this country, because true justice isn't one person behind bars. It's when we can wake up with the confidence to say that this will never happen again. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does it?
Gentlewoman yields back her time. Mr. Frost recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So GAO investigated several national security issues at the Department of Defense and made important information sharing and operational efficiency recommendations to the department. The Pentagon frequently conducts simulations of conflicts or scenarios, so-called war games, to play at the dynamics of potential conflicts across the entire world. These exercises can yield insights that feed future strategies and policies for evaluating potential threats and adversaries. Simulations inform DoD's decision about warfare concepts, capabilities, and plans, and each branch hosts their own war games as well as participating in simulations as well. So, Mr. Dodaro, what would GAO recommend that the Department of Defense do differently to make sure that these exercises have a greater benefit to national security?
Yes, the department established a central repository in 2015 to collect all this information to help make the future plans more effective and to also then learn from the results and share the results across the department. But it's very fragmented. Nobody's in charge, so we recommend you put somebody in charge of the program to lead it over time to make it more effective, and that you have better reporting of information into a central database that would be complete and reliable and allow more effective treatment. The department agreed with our recommendation and has commissioned a study to figure out how best to do this. You know, the department, as you mentioned, when we were charged with looking at overlap, duplication, fragmentation, DOD's kind of like the poster child for this area because they're so large and decentralized. And so there's a lot of opportunities. And it's because they're committed to their mission, but everybody's enthusiastic and they start off in launching, trying to improve these areas in good faith, but they don't have central management leadership as much as they need.
Yeah, I mean, on the topic of the duplication report, this subcommittee held a hearing on examining the root causes of DOD's financial statements and why they can't be audited. What does GAO suggest DOD do to help make sure that it works towards a successful audit?
Yes. First, I might say that they got a clean opinion this year for the Marine Corps for the first time, so I was encouraged by that. They have a good plan, but they need to fix the problems that their independent auditors identify more promptly. They're not really fixing them as much as possible. They also need to get the better control.
Why do you think they're not fixing it as fast?
Well, it's a matter of resources to them. I mean, there's a lot of benefits that they've received from this thing, and the auditors keep finding like hundreds of problems. So that the number keeps growing, but the percentage of them fixing them is stuck at around 20-some% of the corrective action. So they need to move faster. But most of the recommendations, Congressman Frost, deal with their financial systems. Their systems are not designed properly. They have a process now that they put in place to make sure that they're certified, that they meet all the requirements, and they're going to be auditable, you know, but that compliance with those requirements is lacking. And so we've recommended that they better stick with the guidelines they have in place to certify these systems, not only new ones under development, but existing systems. And so we're waiting for them to react to our recommendations there. They said they agreed, but we'll see what they do to implement it. But the system fixes are at the root cause of many of these corrective actions, and that's why you don't see greater progress.
Yeah. I mean, and the reasoning of resources, I don't know. I don't quite buy it, as we're nearing almost $1 trillion defense budget, one I would say is quite inflated. But last thing really quick, GAO also noted fragmentation in DoD research projects on service member fatigue. The report specifically mentions that the repeated use of wearable devices such as smartwatches and heart monitors to identify and mitigate the root causes of service member fatigue. DoD has conducted nearly 50 different studies on this. What did GAO recommend that DoD change when it comes to studying the fatigue of service members?
I'll ask Kathy Barrick to do it. She's our expert in defense capabilities management.
Yeah, thank you. Service member fatigue is really a significant issue at DoD. By DoD's own studies of their service members, 2/3 are reporting getting 6 hours or 6 or few hours of sleep a night. So it's a readiness issue, it's a safety issue, it's a health issue. So there's a lot of research.
And a workplace issue.
And a workplace issue, exactly. There's a lot of research going on in the department, both monitoring service members' sleep, but also looking at things like environmental factors. How can we make, increase the quality of sleep, as well as the health impacts of sleep? We identified 130 research projects, and as you mentioned, 48 in particular were related to wearable technologies that track service members' sleep. These projects were very fragmented. Some of them were looking at the exact same technologies, the exact same models, and there was no coordination within the department to partner on some of this research. And as you can imagine, lots of different offices within DoD are doing this. We looked at cost information for 29 of these 48 projects. It was $25 million. DoD's planning on investing hundreds of millions, million more in this area. The Defense Health Agency, for example, is going to let a contract for $350 million to look at 6 wearable technologies. So there's a lot of opportunity for potential efficiencies. If DoD doesn't procure one of these technologies, it's tens of thousands in savings and potentially hundreds of millions.
Thank you so much. I yield back, and thank you to the chair for allowing the overage.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentlewoman, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for being here. One of the areas, I know there's a lot of duplication in regards.
Back, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Deputy Secretary Turk. In my district, the University of Central Florida is currently working on dozens of projects funded by DOE grants. This includes $1 million to study Central Florida's risks down to the community level of the electric grid failure during severe weather. When storms hit, and especially our hurricanes, because of the climate crisis, they're lasting longer, creating more devastation. And most of the folks who die during these hurricanes, a lot of them die post-hurricane because of the power outages, especially seniors who are unable to use a lot of their devices that are powered by electricity. So this has been the focus of a lot of my legislation, like the Safe Through Medicare Act. With the same goal, Florida received over $30 million in grid resiliency grants from the Biden administration this year alone. I'm really happy to see that DOE's 2025 request would almost double the funding for the Grid Deployment Office, which is really important, of course, to my district, but to folks around the entire country, especially because we continue to see extreme weather events. Secretary Turk, how will the Biden administration focus on grid resiliency to protect Americans from extreme weather?
Well, thanks for your focus on this issue, and I don't need to tell you, living in Florida, what we're already seeing in terms of the impacts of climate change, more severe hurricanes, let alone the heat waves much of our country is facing right now. It was one of our national laboratories that actually took a look at the wind speeds and other factors and features of hurricanes and said we're probably going to need to have a Class 6 hurricane categorization just to deal with the increase in storms, the powerful nature of storms that we're already seeing out there. In fact, last year we had 28 separate billion-dollar weather and climate impacts in our country. That is just a remarkable amount of not only financial impact, but human devastation that's happening. And you're right to focus on grids. Grids are such a key part, making sure we've got resilient grids. Much of our grid infrastructure is quite old, and we need to make sure we're updating that. We're using the state-of-the-art technology. Thankfully, thanks to the President's leadership, Congress's support, through the extraordinary pieces of legislation, the bill and IRA, we have $25 billion to help on grid resilience. $7.2 billion of that over the last year has gone out to states and utilities and others to help on that front. We also have a regular budget as well that we're trying to do cutting-edge research and development on grid technologies, but trying to get those technologies out there as quickly as we can so that your constituents and others will have the reliability and resilient grids that they depend on and should depend on.
Thank you so much. And because you brought up heat waves, we know right now deadly heat waves are around the country. I think it's a stark reminder of the fact that we need to get off carbon-spewing fossil fuels as soon as possible. Extreme heat kills more people than hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, yet it's not necessarily classified as extreme weather emergency, and so that's the thing we're also working on. But this also means there'll be a greater demand for critical minerals, that comes with its own set of environmental problems. Orlando's Precision Periodic, a local company that grew out of UCF's business incubators, recycling critical minerals from used batteries with the help of DOE's funding. How is DOE working to make sure that domestic critical mineral usage is less damaging to the environment?
Yeah, so we absolutely have to diversify our supply chains as we use more lithium, as we use more cobalt. Right now, a lot of that material, much of that material is processed in China. That's not good for our energy security, our economic security, our national security. So we're spending a lot of money and a lot of focus on not just the mining part, the processing part, but you're right to focus on the recycling part as well. As we have more of these minerals in our systems, whether in EV batteries or solar PV panels, or magnets or semiconductors, we need to have the research done now along the lines of what you're talking about so that we have those recycling programs in place, done environmentally friendly, done in a way that has U.S. jobs. We don't export material to be recycled elsewhere to come back into the U.S., and that's what we're spending a lot of time and focus on.
Last question, how important is grid integration into achieving President Biden's goal of having 100% clean energy by 2035?
So it's absolutely vital. We won't be successful not just in decarbonizing our grid, but frankly providing affordable power to providing resilient power in the face of additional climate disasters unless we invest in our grids. The grid is what literally connects it all together.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
And Chair now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start off by saying that I find that bigotry, transphobia, and outright attacks on our LGBTQ plus community, these attacks that we've heard in this hearing today, are disgusting and unacceptable. Ms. Wiley, we've heard a lot of bigotry in this room today. Highly uncomfortable to sit here as one of these witnesses used their testimony time to, I guess, complain about the fact that maybe too many black and brown people are getting jobs, is what that sounded like. Once again, Republicans are trying to stoke fear by claiming that transgender people using the correct locker room somehow endangers cisgender women. Yet research shows that it's trans folks who are in danger. Trans folks are more likely, more than 4 times likely as cisgender people to be the victims of violent crime, including sexual assault. And groups who support victims of sexual assault agree with this. Bipartisan, nonpartisan groups, dozens of groups, including the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. They signed a letter supporting full and equal access to locker rooms for trans folks. So I ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record, as well as a study by Williams Institute that shows the high rates of victimization for transgender individuals.
Without objection, so ordered.
I want to turn to the EEOC's final rule on how to implement Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which, I'll remind my colleagues, passed the United States House of Representatives with over 300 votes with over 200 co-sponsors, a bipartisan piece of legislation that my colleagues didn't have any problems with until they found out that maybe we can use it as a wedge issue to rev up some of our bigoted voters for the election this year. This important act requires employers to accommodate workers with limitations caused by pregnancy, childbirth, or medical conditions. In its rule, the EEOC makes it clear that pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions includes abortion care. Ms. Wiley, my colleagues don't seem to understand why this is so important. Could you walk us through that and explain the potential consequences of undermining this important protection?
Well, I think, Congressman, you just did. I think that is a perfect explanation about the importance of the rulemaking to protect people from discrimination. And here's one of the things that I want to appreciate Attorney General Rokita for, is the acknowledgement that it is the Supreme Court of the United States of America. In fact, a Neil Gorsuch opinion, a conservative justice, that found that Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination also prohibits employers from firing an employee, quote, simply for being transgender, close quote. So what we are hearing from the EEOC is it is taking to heart the directive from the Supreme Court that the plain language of Title VII and its prohibition against sex discrimination covers people who are transgender. And by the way, and as we know with all civil rights laws, when we protect the most vulnerable, we protect everyone. The reason it is so critically important is because those protections extend to everyone. And we should remember that, because it's one of the greatest lessons that we have seen, and why we should absolutely refuse to allow fear-mongering about 1% of the U.S. population. The transgender community in the United States is 1% of the U.S. population. And so the idea that states and localities, 200 municipalities, 18 states, that are already providing the protections against discrimination we are talking about, some of them for years have not seen the fear, the violence, any of the things that we're hearing today. And the reason we are hearing it is because there is not a fact-based disagreement, but an ideological one. And what we should be dealing with is facts, because everyone is protected by our civil rights laws, everyone. And it is the facts that ensure we're protecting the most vulnerable.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wiley. I don't have much time left to get to my other questions, but I just wanted to let you keep talking because I agree with everything that you just said. And it's just a shame to sit in these hearings watching my colleagues attack programs that also are designed to help veterans. So to attack these programs is to attack what I consider true patriotism, which is more than a bald eagle, beer, and flag. It's about loving the people who live in the country, no matter who they are. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Andrea Lucas, who is a commissioner of the EEOC.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for being here. I appreciate the great work that you do. And I hope a lot of members that are bringing up concerns with the office will actually follow up with y'all and create a good relationship with you instead of just taking 5 minutes to get a clip for a YouTube or whatever to post online. Many Floridians acutely recognize that their future is at stake in discussions about climate policy. We're a frontline community, we're a frontline state. Not long ago, I met with Orange County Utilities, the water provider for communities like the area of Bithlo, which is in my district. Most of Bithlo doesn't have access to municipal water and wastewater, only using wells and septic systems. Thanks to ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, Orange County is able to invest $12.6 million in the rural community of Bithlo. Future phases will require further investment, and implementation has begun on phase 1 of the transformational rural water infrastructure project in a portion of the community of Bithlo. We're also looking forward to having the Region 4 administrator visit Bithlo to provide technical assistance resources. I also want to uplift the historic town of Eatonville, which is also in my district. Eatonville is the country's first and oldest black municipality. They are finalizing awards from the EPA's SRF program through the Clean Water Projects and Drinking Water Initiatives. And so we're excited about that and appreciate the EPA for your work. For those who don't know, last year the EPA established the National Environmental Youth Advisory Council. The council met earlier this year for 2 days on February 28th and 29th, and of course I was honored to be at the launch of this council last year. Administrator Regan, during the 2-day inaugural session of the National Environmental Youth Advisory Council, what recommendations or points of focus stood out to you the most, and how do you plan to incorporate them in your vision for the agency?
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us last November. I think the young people were more excited to see you than see me, so you gave us some street cred there. Yeah, we pulled together 16 of some of the smartest young people from across the country, ages 16 to 29. And they spoke very passionately about, number one, our ineffective ability to communicate and connect with young people. Bringing the bureaucratic conversations down a notch. And so we have looked at our education, our outreach, our social media strategies to be sure that our information is getting to folks. Number two, they have made a number of suggestions on how young people can be more involved in our regulation making, our regulatory opportunities. They have given us a number of recommendations that we're still combing through. And three, when they've looked at EPA's agenda for the next 2 to 3 years, there have been some things on our agenda that they've asked us to prioritize and move up a little bit higher. So I just want you to know that we're listening to our young people. They absolutely have a permanent seat at the table. And quite frankly, from what I'm seeing, they're going to make the agency and our products better.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Last April, the EPA put out a national scale report showing how climate change and the climate crisis is disproportionately harming our nation's children. I ask unanimous consent to submit that report to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Some of the key findings highlighted how climate change is expected to increase the incidence of asthma in children, increase asthma-related emergency department visits, increase climate-driven temperature increases that are projected to result in 4 to 7% reductions in annual academic achievement per child, and also, if no additional adaptations are taken, 1 to 2 million children are estimated to experience temporary home displacement or complete home loss due to the climate crisis. With at least half of the National Youth Advisory Council members coming from or working primarily in disadvantaged communities, how is the EPA ensuring that these voices are not only heard, but their concerns are acted upon in a meaningful way?
Absolutely. As we push these reports out, we in between sessions, ensure that they have this level of information. Each session, this is a FACA, this is a formal group, so each session they have with me and my leadership team, they come prepared with recommendations that they adopt or we adopt procedurally. And so it's my hope at the next meeting, they'll come fully prepared to discuss this report along with a series of reports that we are pushing to this group.
Well, I thank you so much for bringing young people to the table to be a part of the great work the EPA is doing. As we know, young people are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and I think we all know the cost of not doing anything is far greater, or the cost of not doing anything is far greater than the cost of waiting. We have to ensure that we defeat the climate crisis and do everything we can. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair. Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And obviously, I want to start by stressing that political violence is always unacceptable and acknowledging that this is still an ongoing investigation. But oversight hearings like this are essential components of an investigation, and I want to thank the Chair for pulling this together. Madam Director, I appreciate you for being here. The events of July 13th raised serious questions about the efficacy and thoroughness of the security protocols in place. The gravity of the fact that an unsophisticated gunman was able to secure his perch and take a shot at a former president, despite multiple layers of security and intelligence, are not lost on me. Before I came to Congress, I used to work advance for a major political candidate and have interacted with many different law enforcement agencies on large political events like the one that just happened. How many times was the Secret Service alerted about a suspicious person at the July 13th campaign event prior to the first shot being shot?
I don't have an exact number to share with you today, but from what I've been able to discern, somewhere between 2 and 5 times there was some sort of communication about a suspicious individual.
To the Secret Service specifically? Mm-hmm. According to reports, the shooter was photographed twice by security officers prior to the shooting. A police officer saw the shooter on the ground and reported him with a photograph as a suspicious person. Multiple local law enforcement officers identified the shooter, radioed that he was acting suspiciously near the event's magnetometers. A local law enforcement tactical team saw the shooter on a roof and notified other security services and also photographed him. One police officer who photographed the shooter saw him scoping out the roof and carrying a rangefinder. My question is, and you've answered this, but why, or you haven't answered this, why wasn't the event paused right then?
Again, I'm not clear on the timeline of when the Secret Service shift and the counter sniper were notified.
But earlier, Madam Director, earlier you said that the Secret Service would have paused the rally if they identified a threat.
Correct.
So why wasn't it paused?
Because I have to assume that they did not know that there was a threat when they brought the president out on the stage.
I feel like this is a breakdown in communication between local law enforcement, you all, and other actors at the rally. And again, as someone who's worked on these, I understand that there's multiple people with multiple decision, with the ability to make different decisions on the ground. I've taken over the last week, I've spoken with a lot of folks in local law enforcement in my district and across the country that I've worked with before, and other people have brought up concerns around being able to communicate with with Secret Service during these big events and having their flags taken seriously. I do believe that if Secret Service believed that there was a legitimate threat, that they would have paused the rally. My concern is before that something was flagged and it wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been taken. So I think this shows an issue with communication, and I want to know, Madam Director, what you intend to do to fix that, not in 60 days, but now. We're in the middle of a presidential election, obviously a former president who had an assassination attempt, another rally goer who was killed due to this gun violence. We now have a presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party who's also historic, first black woman to be running for president. And so I am worried about everybody's life. What do you all intend to do to fix this communication breakdown and making sure that you actually take what local law enforcement, local folks are saying more seriously?
We take what local law enforcement relays to us seriously. Let me just be clear on that. As far as the communication,
but not this time.
We always trust our law enforcement partners and have a great relationship with them. We are looking at whether or not there was a communication breakdown. If that was the case, we will take steps to ensure that we correct that, because to your point, we cannot have a communication breakdown.
Madam Director, does you mentioned that the perimeter of the event did not include the rooftop where the shooter was. Does your responsibility and the Secret Service's responsibility to protect a principal stop at the perimeter of an event?
Our responsibility is to ensure the safety and security of the event itself and the protectee who is attending that event and the personnel who are protecting.
So you would say the fact that the rooftop was outside the perimeter is not an excuse for what happened, saying that it was outside the perimeter of the event?
I am not offering that as an excuse.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas.
How did a 20-year-old loner with a week's notice pick the absolute?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. SIGI and the Integrity Committee are essential to federal government operations and trust in our institutions. Without their work, Inspector General misconduct could go unaddressed. Inspectors General are experts and professionals at uncovering misconduct, fraud, waste, and abuse. Mr. Greenblatt, how does the Integrity Committee help ensure that inspectors general are both transparent and accountable?
So it is the investigatory body that Congress has created to, like I said, investigate allegations of misconduct by IGs and senior folks and a handful of other folks in government, like the special counsel. And it is, one of the things I'd like to say, we had allegations about due process and transparency. The Integrity Committee has a number of mechanisms that ensure fairness, that ensure a fair process, and far more transparency than any other investigatory body I can think of. And they have regular updates to Congress, and we have extensive reporting requirements that are far beyond anything we do in our actual day-to-day jobs as IGs. And so I think Congress should be very confident that the Integrity Committee is acting in good faith. There are a number of very long investigations that have bedeviled the Integrity Committee. I will not shy away from that. I see you shaking your head. That is something we don't disagree on that. That is a significant issue. How we address that issue, we have some ideas, but it is robust and it is designed to get to a fair answer. It is not, it is not, it's not a hammer looking for nails. Quite the opposite. It is trying to operate in a fair environment, and it is remarkably. The processes and procedures, I think, are remarkably fair, and I'm concerned that some of the perceptions about the process are simply not accurate and don't fairly reflect the process. And I'm happy to sit with any member at any time and discuss those issues, as we did, Mr. Chairman, yesterday.
Thank you. I appreciate it. In recent years, we've seen the type of IG misconduct that clearly demonstrates the need for the Integrity Committee. In June of 2021, for example, the Federal Housing and Finance Agency IG, Laura Wettheimer, resigned after the Integrity Committee found that she fostered, and I quote, a culture of witness intimidation through a pattern of staff abuse and fear of retaliation, end quote. In mid-2022, following an investigation by SIGI, the Inspector General for the Securities and Exchange Commission, Carl Heckler, resigned following reports that he refused to act on credible allegations of sexual harassment. Mr. Greenblatt, as an Inspector General yourself, can you briefly describe the kinds of recoveries and enforcement action supported by IG investigations and give us a general idea of the dollar amounts that you've had to deal with?
In the IG community writ large,
yes.
We have had remarkable success. As I mentioned earlier, we had $693 billion in either question cost or recoveries from OIG and oversight efforts over the past 10 years. It's a remarkable, I think last year alone we had $93 billion. That's just 1 year. If you add up all of the IG budgets, and roll them up and compare that with the $93 billion, it's something like a 26 to 1. So for every dollar appropriated to an OIG, we are turning back $26 in potential savings. So this is serious return on investment, and that doesn't include the variety of investigations and audits and inspections that don't include monetary returns. Like I said, the work on preventing suicides, veteran suicides, the work on protecting nursing home, the elderly in nursing homes, protecting tenants in public housing from sexual predators. Those don't have a dollar figure associated with them. So just looking at the financial return on investment, it's 26 to 1 dollar, but that omits an enormous amount of what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. I think the clock was frozen for a little bit, so I had some extra time. I'll just put that in the bank for next time.
I was thinking the same thing. I didn't get a chance to ask questions either. Thank you very much.
Of course, I yield back.
Look, we're on a closing time. We all know that. I want to thank you for taking time. You've done well enough to be invited back. In closing, I want to thank you for your forthrightness. I also want you to know that I'm Maxwell
Maxwell Frost, and I'm proud to be the first member of my generation in Congress. I'm also proud to represent Central Florida. You might expect me to talk about how climate change will impact our future, but as a Floridian, as a Florida man, I'm here to tell you that the climate crisis isn't some far-off threat. It is here. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance think they can divide us by saying this crisis is some type of hoax. But I've walked the streets of communities that have been forced to rebuild after hurricane flooding destroyed their homes. I've heard the stories of immigrant farm workers made to work in horrid conditions exacerbated by this crisis. And I felt the scorching record heat and know that climate change can sometimes feel like an unstoppable force. But with our movement and with organizing and an administration that cares, we are making progress. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have proven that tackling this crisis creates jobs, that investing in clean energy protects our health, and that investing in mass public transit builds strong communities. And we must always remember that peace is essential to our climate and war destroys our environment. This election is about every drop of water that we consume and every breath we breathe. Fighting the climate crisis is patriotic. And unlike Donald Trump, our patriotism is more than some damn slogan on a hat. It's about actually giving a damn about the people who live in this country. Because when you love somebody, you want them to have clean air. When you love somebody, you want them to have safe drinking water. And when you love somebody, you want them to have a dignified job. And so, America, it's simple. Let's get to work and elect Kamala Harris and Tim Walz for our planet, for our future, for our present, and for our people. God bless.
Gentleman yields back her time. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you so much for calling this hearing. Americans have heard about improper pandemic relief payments and the bad actors who took advantage. There are also many folks to what my colleague, Congresswoman Tlaib was just talking about. I have folks in my own family who are, not fraudsters, received incorrect overpayments and were very stressed receiving those letters, receiving those calls, figuring out what they need to do next. These bad actors use the government's need to act urgency as an opportunity to claim taxpayer dollars meant for those who needed it the most. Mr. Horowitz, I want to talk really quick about trends and patterns. You've helped identify several individuals who have stolen and misused COVID relief money. Are these individuals usually pretty sophisticated fraudsters?
We're seeing the range of fraud. It was mentioned earlier about the Secret Service. We've worked with them on international organized crime efforts. On the other hand, you have people who it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to get money. Some people because they thought they really needed more money because they were economically disadvantaged, doesn't excuse the fraud. And other people who were billionaires or millionaires who decided to buy luxury yachts, Lamborghinis. We refer to them as Lamborghini cases sometimes. People stealing the money and buying expensive cars, yachts, diamonds, et cetera, going on trips. We have plenty of those cases, sadly, as well.
And do you feel like the government was very clear in what would be a proper use and improper use of all the funds that people were requesting?
Well, I think one of the challenges with the Small Business Administration programs was the lack of clarity on expectations. And we've heard in other programs that we've had hearings on and discussed with program administrators, the lack of clarity from the agencies on how to implement new programs, the lack of guidance, and that they struggled with states, localities, other entities that were getting grants and loans. That's something that also needs to happen with regularity.
Are there patterns in their behaviors, the fraudsters, that make catching future ones easier to catch?
One of the things I've talked about is avoiding the perfect being the enemy of the good. There are plenty of hurdles we can put in place of people who try to engage in fraud. And what we've seen over and over again, and I was formerly a prosecutor earlier in my career, if you put a hurdle in, or enough hurdles in front of people, you might not stop the most sophisticated fraudster. You might need even more stringent efforts and guardrails, but you're likely to stop most people. Because when they first get the call or are told, you know, you triggered an alert, we want to talk to you, most people who know they're fraudsters drop it right there, right? They don't show up for the interview. And I've again compared it at the airport. If you know there's the magnetometer there, you're probably going to think before you try and walk through with a weapon, right? That doesn't happen with great frequency, fortunately. But if there's no magnetometer there, if it's like for many of these programs, just sign a form and say you're telling the truth and we'll give you the money, you get fraudsters lining up.
Could I add something really quick?
Yes, please.
You know, the Comptroller General testified several times during the pandemic that, you know, GAO put the GAO fraud framework out over almost a decade ago, and agencies didn't implement the practices within. And one example, when you ask about these fraud cases during the pandemic, there was a case in California where an enterprising group of fraudsters applied for unemployment insurance on behalf of every prisoner in the California state penal system, and they got it. So it was, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of you know, obviously improper stolen unemployment insurance. When the California state auditor went back and looked, the state had never conducted a fraud risk assessment. Now, if these things are done well, as the GAO fraud framework clearly lays out, then the state of California would have at some point in that time prior to the pandemic that would have been a fraud scheme. Somebody posing as a prisoner trying to get an unemployment benefit. And then they would say, how would we mitigate that? Well, we'd have access to prisoner data. Do we have access to prisoner data? We do not. So we see a gap. Now we're going to get access to prisoner data, and we've now closed that fraud scheme, that risk. And that's what's, you know, when Ms. Brown is talking about the importance of implementing the GAO fraud framework, that's really a real-world example, is if the state had done that, then they would have known they needed that access to the data prior to the pandemic. They would have gotten that data sharing agreement in place, and that fraud scheme and those hundreds of millions of dollars wouldn't have been stolen.
And that's also the importance of the states and the federal government working together, because California can then share its experience with all the other states, and all the states can look for it. And to his credit, the Department of Labor IG in April put out a fraud alert about this, and that was one of the situations that they put states on alert to. But just to add on to Mr. Horowitz's point with another example, the retention tax credit program is an IRS program, and what they've done is they suspended the program, and they put a pause on all of the folks that had filed claims for this particular tax credit, and they ran analytics, and they identified a number of them as likely fraud, and then they had a category of like a higher risk level that they were uncomfortable with, and then a lower level. And they also offered folks who'd filed a claim an opportunity to withdraw their claim. And a number of people withdrew their claim because it's like, if you know, IRS has now flagged it, so if this is problematic, we're going to give you an opportunity to withdraw your return. So I think that is another example of where an agency was proactive in preventing money from going out the door fraudulently.
Well, thank you to the three of you for being here. I think, you know, something I'm really getting out of this is it's not that, it's that we have a ton of best practices, right, and use cases that we can use in the future. So that way the conversation isn't around not doing programs that are going to help the American people, especially in time of need, but making sure we do it in a better and more efficient way. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is the House Rules Manual, and at the start of Congress, the House approves the House rules. Every Republican member on this committee voted yes to it. On page 640, Rule 11, Clause 4B, it states that this committee, quote, may not be used for any partisan political campaign purpose, end quote. This hearing is in violation of the House rules that we all voted on, including the chair, including all the Republicans on the other side of the aisle. And all we've done in this hearing and over these hearings over this entire year is promote the Trump campaign. And so my question for the chairman or for any Republican is, how can we allow this hearing to continue when we are in direct violation of the House rules?
It's about the Biden-Harris policy.
That's what you
can
say. You
defend
keep
them.
saying it's not about the campaign. It's not about the campaign. But Ms. Gunasekara, during her brief, in their opening, said, quote, "We are less than 2 months away from the election. Democrats are working overtime to rewrite the truth of the Biden-Harris admin." One of my colleagues put up a report card to make the point that Vice President Harris should not be elected. Another one of my colleagues literally asked the witness, quote, "Why should Harris get the job?" End quote. And you expect us to believe that this hearing isn't about the campaign. This committee functions as an extension of the Trump campaign. First, we went after President Biden with a nonsense impeachment hearing. Then we went after his son. Now we're going after the vice president because she's the nominee. And my question is, Mr. Chairman, are we going after Tim Walz next week? Because I hear from my staff that you're planning a hearing on Governor Tim Walz, even though he's been governor for 5 years and his name hasn't been uttered in this room or in this committee until something happened recently. Oh, yes, he became the vice presidential nominee. Is he next?
His son's going to jail.
Oh, okay. I'm talking about Governor Tim Walz.
Okay.
Are we doing a hearing on him next week?
I'll have to check the
You'll
calendar,
have to check.
but I'll
Okay,
let you know.
we'll see what happens next week. Someone whose name has not been uttered in this committee, but now that he's the Democratic vice presidential nominee, we're going to do a hearing on him. A complete, blatant use
Trump
of
is not
official
president.
resources for a political campaign is what this committee has been. And anyone who's taking part in that should be ashamed of themselves. Ms. Perryman, we worked together in 2023 when I hosted an ad hoc hearing to spotlight different issues in the state of Florida. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the ad hoc hearing memo and testimony.
Without objection, so ordered, and we're not doing a hearing on Walz. I just got confirmation.
Oh, okay. For those concerned about Project 2025, people should know that Project 2025 is Florida 2024. Ms. Perryman, there are policies and lawsuits that have been popping up all over my state and across the South. Book bans, abortion bans, voter suppression that are now in the Project 2025 plan for the entire country. The architects of this plan want us to believe that this is some sort of organic grassroots movement, but you and I know that this is really a small group of people. What is so dangerous about this trend for people in every state across America?
Well, Project 2025 would take away rights of the American people and beneficial programs that we have come to rely on in communities across the country. And so I think that, it really presents a profound threat to individual Americans. We've heard a lot about today about the plight of the middle class and the plight of workers in this country, and we know that it is hard for people to make ends meet. But Project 2025 would seek to undermine things that the Biden-Harris administration have done, for instance, to qualify millions of American workers for overtime pay, and it would reduce a lot of programs that working families rely on.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 people in the state of Florida are responsible for about 50% of the book bans across the entire state. That doesn't sound like an organic grassroots movement to me. Ms. Perryman, of the policies these extremists are testing in Florida, which ones do you see these same groups laying the groundwork for at the national level, and how are they doing this?
Well, certainly attacks on the freedom to read, attacks on public education, attacks on just very basic ideas and history we see in Florida. We've also seen, of course, the governor of Florida seek to establish a state military and to try to deploy those individuals for his purposes, and we see a variety of those themes in Project 2025.
And we see it happening right now with Amendment 4.
Absolutely.
I don't have much time left, but I just want to say Trump is trying to make it out like he doesn't know anything about Project 2025, but I do not buy it for 1 second. Not when this committee that functions as an arm of the Trump campaign invites Project 2025 authors to be their credible witnesses to attack the Biden-Harris administration. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Fallon.